Hello, everyone. Welcome to 2017 Dyslexia Summit. Today, our guest is Maria Toglia, and she's a certified school psychologist and a parent of a child with dyslexia. Well, welcome, Maria. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like this session is one of the most critical session of the summit because this is where people who have the feeling of, is there something that's a bit off? Is there something that we need to look into a bit more? Should our child get diagnosed or should we get him tested? It's all these questions that are in parents' minds, but they don't know what the next step is. And I feel like this is the most important step because it's the first step to get a diagnosis and have a clear path to for the child to be able to succeed in the academic world.
Right. I agree.
So maybe we can start with, what is dyslexia? What are the signs of dyslexia? What should be parents looking at, and what should they be alarmed with? Because there's some developmental delays that are relatively normal, and the children can overcome that, relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So not everyone who's not reading grade level in the kindergarten or first grade level has dyslexia, but there's some very unique signs that even at a really early age, parents should be alarmed. So maybe you can start with that.
Okay. Well, dyslexia is a language-based learning disability, and it is happening at the level of the brain. So it's neurologically based. We call it language-based because it affects a child's ability to develop skills that involve language, and reading is the primary skill. So kids with dyslexia typically have trouble learning their letters, learning letter sounds, reading words in isolation. Often kids will get little note cards with flashcards with words that they are supposed to be learning, and they're struggling with that. Kids will struggle with fluency, so being able to read smoothly without error. Kids will struggle with spelling, with writing, with written expression. But it's important to say also that it's very common for kids who go on to receive a diagnosis of dyslexia have already had difficulty with speech and language delays. So because both understanding written language and understanding oral language are very connected in the brain. Students who have had trouble developing language skills are late talkers, for example, or have trouble with grammar. Not always, but it's very common to see kids who go on to have a diagnosis of dyslexia have had those problems early on learning to speak.
So there are some early signs, and there are some signs that are further as the child advances in grades.
Right.
So maybe we can start with the early signs.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that just like how we experience, sometimes the early signs aren't there, and the later signs can emerge. For example, with my son, we had 0 signs until first grade. He could rhyme, he could sound the letters out correctly,
Mm-hmm.
but he just couldn't put the letters together and create or read words. And it was as if overnight, from kindergarten to first grade, it's just a brick wall just appeared.
Right. And that's not uncommon. Sometimes kids will get to a certain level and you think everything is going well, and then all of a sudden they get to a point where they can't accommodate what's going on and they can't adjust to what's going on. Very early on, learning to speak is something that our brains are wired for. And so most kids will learn how to speak just being exposed to language in their families and in the community. Now, learning to read actually involves converting those areas of the brain that are wired for oral speech into written text. And so when you see a child who's struggling learning to speak, that is a red flag. As I said, not all of these kids go on to be dyslexic, but it's something that needs to be monitored. And typically these kids are often seen in early intervention. This tends to be picked up by pediatricians when they're in their well visits and asking questions about how many words does your student have, how many sentences can they put together sentences, things like this. Very common for this to be picked up by a pediatrician. What's not common, though, is for the pediatrician to understand that this might be an early sign of a later learning disability that won't come up until later. So that's probably one of the earliest signs. Another thing that can happen is kids will have trouble with sequencing, understanding things that go in a specific order, remembering directions. Remembering people's names tends to be difficult for kids who will go on to have dyslexia. These are the kinds of things that are not necessarily academic, but come up in family life. My son was like that. He had a very difficult time remembering names and would avoid saying people's names because of that. Later on, when kids are in preschool, it's very common for teachers to begin presenting letters of the day, for example. A letter of the day is B, and they'll talk about the sounds that go along with those letters and words that go along with those sounds, and typically beginning sounds, so boy, bat. And kids who go on to have dyslexia will have a hard time understanding the relationship between that letter and the sound that it makes in a word. And we call that phonological processing. That is the technical term for your ability to see a letter and know, or see a word, excuse me, and know that there are specific sounds that are put together that create that word. And early signs of that difficulty include having trouble learning the alphabet and having trouble learning the sounds that are associated with letters. And you mentioned rhyming, and that's something that is often seen too. Very common to read books to your kids that involve rhyming. And some kids really get into that and understand that and are then able to anticipate the words that are going to come up in the story because they know the rhyming word. Kids who go on with dyslexia might have a lot of trouble with that.
I see. That's great information. So how about the later signs where I think I would say maybe first, second grade about?
Okay, so in first, second grade, you're getting word rings probably at home, right, with a sight word. They want kids to have a sight word vocabulary. So these are the basic words, the, in, her, him. And so what you'll notice is even with repetition, students will not hold on to the ability to recognize these words automatically. So you might be sitting with your student and working with them, and he or she might get it eventually after some tries. But then when you come back the next day and work on that same set of words, you notice, wow, he or she is not getting it. They don't remember those words, or it takes a long time. So it's the real difficulty that kids have becoming automatic with developing that sight word vocabulary, reading words just out of context by themselves. And then later, as kids get a little bit older, of course, they're starting to read little storybooks. And what you notice with students who go on to have difficulty is their reading tends to be choppy. They're reading one word at a time, and they're making a lot of mistakes on the page. Sometimes they're losing track of where they are on the page. So they're having difficulty keeping on the same line, they're skipping forward, or they're just getting confused. So this is fluency. This is the ability to read accurately. It's also the ability to read quickly enough so that you can keep all that information in your mind and keep track of what's going on in the story. So fluency is something that, or a lack thereof, is something that you'll notice with kids who are struggling readers. They're not reading accurately, they're making lots of mistakes, and they're going slowly. So this is really taxing their working memory, their ability to keep track of what's going on, which again affects comprehension. The other things that go on is you are learning how to spell words as you're in early elementary school. And it's very common for kids who struggle to have a whole lot of trouble with spelling. These are kids who, because they're having trouble with that matching the sound with the letter, are really having trouble putting it together and writing the word correctly, even with a lot of practice and repetition. Like when you are practicing with the word ring, you're practicing the spelling, and they might be able to get it on that one instance, but they take the test even after they've studied, and they have a really hard time because they can't remember the spelling sequence. So that's what typically comes up in early elementary school.
And not being able to retain the information that's learned is I think, a big sign you're right.
It is. It is. It's you've done it. You've practiced, and then when it comes time to show what you know, it's very difficult for these kids. Mm-hmm.
As you know, my son was tested and diagnosed just before he turned 7, so it was in the first couple of months of first grade.
Right.
And I understand that's kind of early to diagnose, but one thing that was, huge for me, and I knew in my gut that he had dyslexia, was
Mm-hmm.
that we got a new book from the library that day, and it had a lot of nice illustrations in it.
Mm-hmm.
And he was reading it, and it wasn't, as you said, it was choppy, because I feel like the books we had in the house, he memorized them already.
Yes.
So he was reading now from memory, not by
Right.
looking at the words. And this new book, the images were all like, we had a boat there, and there was a dog there, and
Mm-hmm.
he would read it like, oh, the ship and a pup. So he
Yes.
would look at the picture and make up words, and he kind of figured out the story with a few words he could read.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't reading it, he was guessing
Right.
what it was.
That's
And
right.
when I said, well, how is it going? He said, well, it's okay, I didn't memorize the book yet.
Ah.
And I was like, okay, you don't memorize. He doesn't even have the concept of what reading is at that
Right.
at that time. And I knew that I really had to get him diagnosed. And I know that's kind of early for quite a lot of schools to say, let's test someone who's at age 6.
Well, and there's a myth that you can't really diagnose dyslexia until later, but that's not true, because especially if there has been a family history of dyslexia, because we know that it runs in families, or even if it's not a history of dyslexia per se, but of reading difficulties or learning difficulties. If you put that together with speech and language delays, and then difficulty learning the alphabet and difficulty acquiring a sight word vocabulary, all of those things together point to difficulty with reading. And a skilled professional should then be able to tell whether or not this is something that requires intervention. And you were lucky that you were able to get your son diagnosed so early, because intervening early is the key. It's the key to the child's success. The brain is rapidly developing, and the quicker we can get in there and help teach children explicitly how to read, the faster they will be able to overcome it, and the faster they will be able to read on grade level. Because the implications for not being able to access text are enormous. What we notice is that kids, first of all, their vocabulary development suffers. So the number of words that kids know the meaning of begins to decrease rapidly. Their background knowledge suffers. So because they're not accessing text on their own, they're unable to build up that knowledge that you get just from reading for pleasure or reading in school. And so, of course, those things, vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge, are big predictors for academic success in general, and are big predictors for reading comprehension. So later on, when you get a piece of text and it has information that you've never seen before, you don't know about, or words that you don't know, you're not going to be able to understand it. So getting at kids early when you see these signs is extremely important. And this has all been laid out very clearly from the National Reading Panel, which was done in the early 2000s, which indicated that, giving kids some intervention in phonological processing early on will cut down the number of students that end up being identified for specific learning disability. It has a huge effect. Unfortunately, this has not been widely adopted in the schools. It is usually not the case that kids will get this kind of specialized teaching, even though we know it works. And it works for all kids, not just for kids with disabilities. It actually helps everyone.
That is so true. I feel like on all of our journey in the last 3 years, the single most important factor to bring my son from where he was to where he is today, and he's going into 4th grade,
Mm-hmm.
he was diagnosed early and we had early intervention.
That's right.
It helped with him not falling behind from early on. So
Mm-hmm.
the gap that was between him and his classmates were relatively small.
Yes.
And we kept on working, it's a hard work, and it will always be hard. We realize that.
Yes.
But the gap was relatively small, where the frustration and effect on his self-esteem did not really take a big hit.
Good.
And I think it's also that he didn't start guessing. He didn't start the bad habits of
Yes.
reading.
Mm-hmm.
Things that we didn't have to undo, he didn't have to unlearn things and relearn the right way. So from the get-go, when he was starting to learn, he learned the phonologically way.
Yes, yes. He had a systematic, explicit instruction, which is what kids need. And, a lot of kids will we call it, they break the code intuitively. They know how to read and they figure out the English language code intuitively. But kids who do not do that need it broken down explicitly, and they need a multisensory approach that allows them to go at their own pace with a lot of corrective feedback and practice. Because as you said, when you give that to them, they will close that gap and they will feel better about themselves, because what you don't want is for students who struggle to start to avoid reading or to avoid academic tasks. Because it's very common for these students to have anxiety when they're noticing that everybody around them seems to be doing it. Why can't I do it? And we also know that anxiety increases the difficulty you have thinking, because the cortisol levels go high. So you're absolutely right. Getting in there early is essential. And it's not the case that you have to wait until they're in third grade and they're failing and they're avoiding school.
That's true. So, so now that we talked about the signs of dyslexia, if parents say, okay, now I think my child has dyslexia, what's the next step to get it diagnosed? Like, who can diagnose dyslexia? I know some schools do it. Is that sufficient? Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, all schools have to be able to do it. There are federal laws that indicate that schools have to be proactive in seeking out children who they suspect have a learning difficulty. So if there are signs in the classroom and teachers and parents are talking about this, it is the school's responsibility to do that. Now, sometimes parents have to push that. Sometimes parents have to say, and many times, my student is not progressing, my student is struggling, my student is crying and doesn't like homework and doesn't want to come to school, something is wrong, we need to figure out what this is. And it's parents that have to be their advocates. Schools all have certified school psychologists employed, and it's the school psychologist who primarily does evaluations. It's not uncommon for speech and language therapists to be involved in evaluation for a student, given that language and reading are connected. It's also not uncommon for a reading specialist to be involved in evaluation. But primarily, you're looking for the school psychologist to do a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation and looks at all the components of reading and looks at the psychosocial aspect of things, because as I said, it's very common for kids who are struggling to have some anxiety or other things going on that are contributing. So it is important that it's a trained professional, like a school psychologist, child psychologist, sometimes neuropsychologists can do this as well. If you're going outside and seeking out a private professional, they should absolutely be a licensed professional in psychology or school psychology, and they should have specific training in looking at kids with learning disabilities and dyslexia. In schools, you're going to have what's called a multidisciplinary evaluation, meaning that people are going to contribute from different areas. So there will be parent input, there will be teacher input, and there will be the input from standardized testing. So you want to make sure that they do a very comprehensive evaluation of, first, your students' cognitive skills, their intellectual skills, because that plays a role. You also want them to look at their early reading skills, especially if they're young, phonological processing, which may or may be done by the psychologist or speech and language person. You want to look at something called rapid naming, so their ability to automatically say what they see is a big deal. Working memory is huge when it comes to reading. Working memory refers to being able to keep multiple pieces of information in your mind at the same time. And this has a dramatic effect on your ability to keep things going and understand what you're reading. You want to make sure that they look at reading fluency, decoding skills, word reading skills, and then of course comprehension skills. You want that student to read aloud and get a sense for how many mistakes they're making and whether they're self-correcting and what kinds of mistakes they're making, whether there are certain patterns to those mistakes. That's where the reading specialist usually is very valuable, is really looking at those patterns of mistakes. You also want to look at spelling, because difficulty with phonological processing and reading go hand in hand with spelling. You want to look at written expression. You want to look at math, because often kids with dyslexia or in the school system, they're going to call it specific learning disability in reading. They're not going to use the word dyslexia. But kids who struggle with reading often struggle with math also. They struggle with math facts. They struggle with word problems. They struggle with concepts, because even though math is involving numbers, there are a lot of language-based skills involved in learning math. You want them to take a family history, a health history, a developmental history, so that when they have all the information, they can put it together and tell a story about your student as a learner, what their strengths are, what their needs are, and whether or not your child meets criteria for a classification or a diagnosis. In public school, they're going to call it a classification. They're not going to call it a diagnosis, because special education has very specific rules, and there are 13 classifications of special education. And if your student is one with dyslexia, then they will be classified with a specific learning disability. You're much more likely to get the word dyslexia used if you go to a private psychologist. Then they feel freer to use the word dyslexia. Here in the state of Pennsylvania, it is not the case that we can't use the word dyslexia. We absolutely can. Our legislators have made it clear that we can use that language in evaluations, but it is still not a part of the formal classification in terms of special education. And if a student qualifies with a disability, then the determination has to be made, does that student require specially designed instruction, which means something different from the regular education curriculum to help him or her develop the skills that they need to make the progress that's appropriate for their age and grade.
Well, that's great information. So if the parents see the test results and they don't include all these detailed information that you just gave us, that would be a red flag that maybe the right testing or the extensive testing hasn't been completed. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, well, yes. And what I would do as a parent is be proactive and become educated about what is included in a comprehensive evaluation and request it from the school. And if the school says that they're not willing to do that, then that's an indication that you might have to go out. And if even after you've made this request, it hasn't happened, and you don't feel like it's a comprehensive evaluation, then that's a time when you might consider going outside and getting a private evaluation. There's a lot of variability, just like in any profession or any institution. You're going to come across some very good school psychologists who are working in the public schools, who are going to do very thorough jobs. You're going to come across folks who are not going to do thorough jobs. That's just the way it is. And if you end up being lucky and you get somebody good and thorough, then that's wonderful, because A, you don't have to pay for it, and B, your child gets his or her needs met sooner, because the process just goes a lot quicker.
So what is the typical age the school would test if they see that there might be a need for it? And can the parents push for this testing much earlier if they feel that there might be a need for it?
Right. So a couple of things. One is, it probably depends on whether or not the student comes into public school having had early intervention, because a lot of kids do. A lot of kids will come in with earlier intervention. All of those students will have an evaluation upon entrance to kindergarten. Now, it may be the case that psychologists may be reluctant to classify a student with a specific learning disability very early like that, before they have had instruction. So my feeling is that they usually have to at least have been in kindergarten for a period of time and have actually had instruction to be able to then say, okay, the student's not making progress with this instruction. Now let's take a look, especially if there has a history of speech and language delays, family history, and all the other things I talked about. So sometimes if the difficulty is glaring, you will get an evaluation in kindergarten. But if the child is sort of moving along and they might be slower than their other classmates, it is not uncommon for that child just to continue on to first and to second grade until it becomes very readily apparent to the teacher that the student is not keeping up. Now, parents should always keep in mind that if they themselves have a concern, and it's a greater concern than the teachers are expressing, they can request an evaluation at any time. And I would suggest that they do it in writing. You write a letter, you send it to the administrators in your pupil services office or your special education office, and you request an evaluation. Now, that request has to be responded to within 10 days. In 10 days, they need to give you some kind of a response. They either have to say, okay, we will do this evaluation, or they will say, no, we're not going to do this evaluation, but they have to provide you with a rationale and a reason. And at that point, if you disagree with them, you can take steps to get mediation, and there are a whole bunch of legal things that you can do to try to get schools to evaluate your child if they refuse. But my experience is typically if the parent is adamant and the parent wants an evaluation, especially if it looks like this child is struggling, it's very hard for schools to rationalize saying no. So parents can always request an evaluation and create a paper trail.
That's great. So how about for parents who sometimes feel like they don't want to put a label on their child, and they said we don't want them tested because they're coming along well, and maybe they'll just wait a little bit longer, and why put them into a box name with dyslexia, even if they are, because they're getting along well.
Right.
So how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, as a parent, I understand that. I understand that parents want their kids to be, first of all, they want their kids to be happy. They want their kids to be doing well. They want their kids to be feeling good about themselves. And their biggest worry is that, oh my gosh, if I do this and they end up getting a diagnosis and needing something, that's going to affect how they feel about themselves. It's going to affect the way other people see my child. But the reality is that kids, they know when they're struggling. They understand when something's difficult. They understand when they see that they're having a harder time than the kids around them. Even if they're limping along and able to keep up sufficiently, such that people are saying, okay, let's just push them along. Kids know that. And there is no amount of avoiding that takes that away. And it is doing the student a disservice to avoid calling things what they are because you want to try to spare their feelings or spare something that you might think is going to cause them harm to their self-esteem. Because continuing along and then eventually getting to a point where you're really struggling and then really having difficulty is a very difficult experience for kids. It is much healthier for the student to be educated in an honest way about what their strengths are, what are they good at, and the areas where they're not that great. Because we all have things we're good at, we all have things that we're not good at. And to try to deny that is not healthy. And it sets the student up for failure, essentially. So I would say, I understand your concern, I understand that you're worried, but in the long run, this is going to be the best thing for your student, because getting them what they need educationally as quickly as you can is going to be the best way to get your child performing at the level that they need to be performing and help them to be successful in life. And waiting is only going to make matters worse.
I agree with that, and I full-heartedly believe that children know that there's something that's off. My son, he was just in the first couple of weeks in first grade, he was saying, and he was good at math. He could, we still struggle with math facts still, but he
Yeah.
gets the logic of math, and he would come to me and say, I can't do math anymore. And he
Yes.
was sad. And I said, what happened? He said, it's just
Mm-hmm.
too many words, too
Mm-hmm.
many word problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in his mind, he put himself in a box where he was good in math, but not any longer. Now he can't do math.
Right.
But he couldn't understand the reasons behind it. And he just said, I think I'm not good at it
Right.
anymore.
Right. So
And
with
as a 6-year-old, that was his logic. And he connected the dots in the best way he could. And he came up with the
yes.
solution.
Yeah, well, and you're right. So if kids aren't educated about their learning profiles, they will make up a reason in their own heads for why things are going. And a lot of times it's because I'm dumb, I'm just not as good as other kids. And so it is much better to be honest with students about what is going on with them. First of all, it relieves the anxiety because they're thinking to themselves, oh, there's an explanation. That's why it's hard, and it also begins to teach them early on about self-advocacy because that's what they're going to have to learn how to do as they get older. Now, when kids are young, their parents are their advocates, but the sooner that you can get your student talking about what works for them, the better. It feels empowering, and it's a confidence builder to be able to say, I know how I learn, I know what I need to learn, and this is what you need to do to help me, teacher, because this is your job. And the quicker a student can learn those skills, the better.
I agree with that so much. We just told that, some people are right-handed, some people are left-handed, some people, think with their right brain more, some people think with their left brain more. And I
Yes.
think it just now is something that he lives with, and he'll take, it will be with him forever.
Right.
And he says, as at age 9 now, oh, it's going to be harder. I'll work at it, and it'll
Yeah.
be all right because I have dyslexia, and some things are just like that.
That's exactly right. And hiding the correct terminology from kids, like, people who say, I don't want to use the word dyslexia, or I don't want to use learning disability, that intimates that there should be shame associated with those words. And the reality is there is no shame. It's just the way things are, as you said. And so attempting to hide it from the student gives a message that there's something that they should be ashamed of about themselves. And that's negative for them. So it's much better to be open and honest. And if a parent can be accepting of it, it's much easier for the student to be accepting of it. If you can say, hey, I love you, this is how you are, and it's fine. The student's going to have a much easier time accepting that themselves.
And if you look out there, in the world, there's so many so successful people with dyslexia.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And now as we read through biographies, and it says, oh, Steve Jobs had dyslexia,
Yes.
Walt Disney had dyslexia.
Right.
My son is like, oh, look at them, they're just like me, and I could see that spark in his eye. And
Yes.
it's just the way it's presented. It's not that he's any less, but it's just another.
Yeah, it's just the way he learns.
And many people are successful.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be the kind of barrier that people think it is. It's just that you learn differently and you need certain things. And that's the way it goes in many aspects of our lives. So.
And this brings a good point where, and I feel strongly about not calling dyslexia a learning disability,
Mm-hmm.
but a learning difference.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that we have to use the word disability, because of the way the laws are written. Could you touch on that a little bit? Because not everybody might be clear on that.
Right. Well, because, when we think about the word disability, we think that someone can't do things, right? I mean, that's what it basically means for most people. And what dyslexia really is, it's a difference in the way the brain learns. And so it doesn't have to do with intelligence. It has to do with the way the brain is wired for language. And so it's a difference. And what we have noticed too is that kids with dyslexia often have extraordinary skills in other areas. And so it doesn't make sense to think of a child as disabled when they're struggling in one area but doing really well in other areas. Because dyslexia is not defining. It does not define who you are as a person. It's a part of you. It's an aspect of you, but it is not who you are as a whole person. And so just like we all have different types of needs for nutrition and exercise and medical stuff, and we need different things emotionally, we're all wired differently. Learning is the same way. Some of us need this, some of us need that, and some of us need more. And that's the way it is. You're right. Learning disability is a term that's used because that's the way you get the money. That's the way you get the services in school, and that's the way you get the money. And that's why the terminology is that it is. But there's been much more sensitive language used now in terms of describing kids who learn differently.
So we talked about the diagnosis, and now the parents get the diagnosis from school. So what are the next steps that they should be asking from school, or if they want to get support outside? What are their options, and how can they help their children?
Right. So the good news is that we know what to do when a student is struggling with reading. We have great research. We understand what works. And there's lots of professionals now in the world who know how to do this, not just teachers. There's lots of tutors, okay? So you can go to the school for some things, and the school, and again, this varies. Certain districts are very well set up to deal with kids who need that type of explicit, multisensory, systematic instruction in reading. Some of them have really well ingrained programs. And they're up and running, and when a child is diagnosed, the team says, okay, we understand that the child needs special education, and they ask for the parent's permission to be able to provide those services. The parent says yes or no, and if they say yes, the child will get usually an IEP, an individual education plan with specific goals that are connected directly to whatever their needs are that were identified in the evaluation. And those services will be provided in school. And there will be regular reports about the child's progress, okay? Again, lots of variability in the degree to which this happens in an effective way. Some schools do it beautifully. Some schools do not do it well at all, okay? If you are in a school that does not do it well at all, then sometimes you have to look outside for resources. There are a lot of what we call Wilson-trained tutors. So that Wilson just happens to be one of the most popular intervention strategies for kids who struggle with learning. But basically what you're going to look for is what we call Orton-Gillingham-based instruction. And that refers to what I've been saying, that phrase, that explicit, systematic, multisensory instruction. That's what we know works. It's been proven over and over and over. It has to be done in a way that is, in the way that the program has been intended. So it's not enough just to do a little here and a little there. It has to be a consistent intervention. And I'm sure you know, it has to be something that you work with your child every single day. So if you're going to be sending your student to tutors, or if your student's going to be getting services in school, you as a parent also need to be involved. It can't just stop there. It's very important to read every day with your child, to read to them, to have them to read to you. Parents are going to have to go out and find resources, and it can be difficult because it can be expensive. And so you need to look for organizations where you can get some support. And depending on where you are in the country, you're either going to have a lot of resources around you, or you're going to have very few resources around you. And I think this is one of the reasons why you're doing this, so that you can help parents figure out, how do I get these resources? One of the organizations that is very, very committed to helping children learn to read is the International Dyslexia Association. And this is a resource where you can contact them and find out what is available in your area, either for free or for nominal payments. or private tutoring, whatever it is that's around, that's a really good place to start. I know here in Pennsylvania, we are very lucky if you are on the easternmost end of the state and the westernmost end of the state. If you're in the middle, it's much, much harder. There are fewer resources out there. So part of it depends on where you live. Part of it depends on your economic ability to pay for outside services. But there's lots of information online. There are communities, and you need to hold your school accountable. It is absolutely in the law that if a student has a need, it is up to that school to address that need. Now, if the school says, well, we don't have that, then you as a parent don't just accept that. You say, well, you have to get that. You have to do that for my student. And sometimes it can be difficult and contentious, but again, you're your student's advocate, and sometimes that's the only way you're going to get it. So I wouldn't accept the words, we don't have that from school, because they have to get it if your child needs it. And it's driven by federal and state law.
It is the child's right to learn.
It is the child's right to learn. It's been well established. And, yes, there are economic realities. Absolutely, we understand that. But the other side of that coin is that the schools have no choice. They have no choice. They have to meet the needs of the student. Sometimes I've worked with students who do very well in the curriculum that's available in a public school. I've worked with students who have needed to be placed in specialized schools that address kids with learning differences specifically. I've worked with students who have had a combination of supports. Either they're getting things both in school and outside of school with tutoring. I mean, there's lots of different ways. And it also depends on the degree of impairment. If a student has a very significant difference in the way that they're learning to read, that student is going to need intensive services. Some students are less impaired and will make progress more quickly. And those kids aren't going to need quite as much in terms of intensity. So again, that evaluation is really important. That evaluation should be able to point you in the direction of not only what does that student need, but how much of it, how intense does it need to be? And that's what parents need to understand. And understanding those evaluations can be very difficult and tricky because there's a lot of technical language. So again, I would suggest that you really hold the psychologist and anyone else involved accountable for making sure that you understand what they have written in those reports. They should be able to explain it to you in a way that you understand. And it's not okay for you to walk away from a meeting not understanding what they've said. That's not okay. And if you need to have more than one meeting, you have to have more than one meeting. That's the way it is.
That is so true. Another great resource is, especially for people, as you said, that might not have too many resources around them, is Decoding Dyslexia.
Yes.
It is an organization as grassroots. Parents are just trying to help each other to get the support they need from the school system. And I've been to a few of their meetings. They're just phenomenal people who have been through they've been through the path before, and they fought for the things that we enjoy today. And they have so much experience, and they share so willingly. So I'll put the website in the links in the below. And you can find, when you go to the general website, decodingdyslexia.com, there are links for different states, and you can click on your state and their local chapters. So when you meet the people in your local chapter, they would know a lot more about your school district and the things that are readily available, or things that are available if you fight for them, and they can guide you through an enormous amount of information.
Right. That's great. Yeah, and they're national, so that's awesome. Each state usually has, we have the Children's Dyslexia Centers, we have the Dyslexia Literacy Coalition here in Pennsylvania, and so each state are likely to have those kinds of organizations as well.
Yeah. And then if you need further support, there are Dyslexia Advocates in probably in every state, and they can help you with the diagnosis. Try to help they can help you understand what it means and what support your children need. And I believe the next step would be a lawyer, which I think would be when you're fighting for the resources and the school is clearly saying,
Yeah.
we don't have the resources to give you.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate that is true. Advocates are important, and that can be very useful in diffusing the conflict between parents and schools, because schools really do want to avoid going to due process with attorneys. And so when you feel like you're not getting anywhere with your school just by yourself, it is useful to have an advocate there, because it signals a couple of things. One, that you understand what your rights are, and two, that you mean business. And another resource that I would strongly recommend to parents is a website called Rights Law. It's WRIGHTS Law. And it's an excellent site. It lays out all of the issues related to learning differences, learning disabilities, special education. It tells you about resources. It educates parents about how to prepare for meetings. It's a great resource. So I would strongly suggest having that available to parents as well.
I certainly will. I was at a parents' conference in October up in Massachusetts at Wilson, and there were some quite well-known people in the panel, and we were laughing, but I thought that something they said really stuck with us, even though it sounded funny when we first listened. They said, you first go and fight for your child, and if you don't get hurt, you go in with a voice recorder. And then you go with an advocate, then you go with a lawyer, and somewhere along these meetings you will get what you need for your child, and hopefully you won't need any or all of that, but
right.
But that's the path. And unfortunately, as you said, some parents have to fight that much.
They do. But going in as prepared as you can and as educated as you can from the beginning, I think is really useful, because if administrators and teachers understand that they're working with a parent who knows what they're talking about, then they are more responsive. So be a squeaky wheel, and don't be afraid of offending people. You're not there to make friends with these folks. You're there to make sure that they understand what your student needs and that they're going to give it to him or her.
That's true. And one of the panelists was a parent as well, and she said that she could tell with certainty that her children got way better accommodations than some other children, because she worked in Wilson and she knew what she was talking about. She was in the field, and she went very prepared, asking for very specific accommodations.
Yes, that's exactly.
And nobody wanted to fight, which is unfortunate. But the better prepared we are as parents, get the best we can for our children, which is their right. At the end of the day, it makes life easier for everybody.
It does, and it's hard to do, and it takes a lot of time, and it's kind of scary, and sometimes you get emotional, but you're absolutely right. From my perspective, watching the parents who came to us, in meetings and were absolutely adamant, you're right, those kids had the best IEPs. They had the folks who were working with them more on their toes and making sure, and so you have to be that person, and even if it goes against your grain in terms of just the way you like to act, what your personality is. Not everybody's like that. Not everybody is comfortable with being sort of aggressively asking for things, but it really makes a difference.
So so as a parent, you would get the maybe IEPs, and they say, okay, this is what we will do in school to help your child. So why should you say it would be alarming to say this is not working because there is no progress? Or sometimes I hear there's progress, but the testing isn't done at the grade level, and some maybe easier reading is given to these children, and they're graded on some easier questions. So how would you know that your child is actually progressing at grade level and they are where they're supposed to be?
Well, it's probably the case that most kids who have dyslexia are going to start out being behind grade level. And so they are going to have to be assessed on a different level. But what you want to see is the term that is used in school is meaningful academic progress. So, but what I think you need to see is you want to see a year's gain in a year's time. Now, that does not always happen because of the nature of dyslexia, especially if it's a child with a significant impairment, you're not always going to see a year's progress in a year's time. That's what we expect from kids without disabilities, at least a year. Now, it's going to be different for each child. Some children with dyslexia, with the proper accommodations, are going to be able to make that kind of progress. Some kids are going to make less progress in a year's time. Maybe they'll go up a half a year or 3/4 of a year. But what you want to see is continuous progress. You want to see progress that's monitored frequently. So what you don't want is to get a report in a year saying, okay, little Johnny or little Susie has made half a year of progress. What you want to see is progress at least quarterly, probably more frequently. How is that child doing from week to week, from month to month? And you want to see an upward trend the whole time. And then if you start to see a flattening out of progress, which is common, then you have to reconvene and determine, okay, what do we need to be doing differently? So you don't want the child to languish and flatten out and not continue to make progress. And you need to make sure that the team that's working with them is willing to address the fact that things have flattened out and we need to change that. Now, let's say that doesn't happen, okay? In the worst case scenario, the child's not making progress or the child is flattening out and they're not making progress and the school is saying, well, we're giving your child everything that we have. Then that's when you start to say to yourself, perhaps this is not the proper environment for my child. Maybe my child needs something more or something different. And that's when you have to start to be aggressive in saying, well, if you're not able to provide the services that my child needs in order to make progress, we need to be looking at outside options. Now, of course, schools want to avoid this at all costs because it's very expensive. So if I were a school, I would be very motivated to be making sure that I had a variety of curriculum available that I could turn to. Because yes, we know that Wilson works for lots of kids. We know that Orton Gillingham is very effective. But kids come with variable learning profiles. And it's not the case that it's just phonological processing that's getting in the way, or it's just a word recognition or word fluency issue. There are many other things that go on that affect reading, like working memory, for example, or now the research is showing something called orthographic mapping, a very complicated set of processes that are related to language. You know, there needs to be flexibility in programming for kids, and it's not going to be a one-fit-all. It's going to have to be what is working for my kid and what do we need to add, or let's say your student has really mastered decoding and really doesn't need to be spending as much time on decoding, but seems to be falling behind because they're not getting enough practice with comprehension skills. Then the shift needs to happen from decoding to comprehension. Or perhaps the child is really good at decoding, but really poor at fluency. They're still making a lot of mistakes. You know, then the focus needs to be on how do we improve that fluency. So progress monitoring is key. Identifying the specific needs of the child and tailoring interventions to that child are essential. And then when progress either doesn't happen or flattens out, there needs to be an adjustment made.
That's so true. So my last question is, one thing that I've heard from parents is accommodations are given and support is given early on. And as you said, dyslexia is a grayscale. You know, some kids catch up quickly, especially early on, and they might be able to get into a level where they're where their peers are.
Yes.
And then the is taken away.
Yes.
And then they start falling behind, and then they say, well, we can't give the support unless they fall behind. So it seems like a very illogical thinking. But how can parents, how can parents fight this one?
That's a tough one. You're absolutely right about that. I deal with this all the time. It happens in many areas of special education and in education in general. The way that I address it is to say that these are the conditions under which the student is able to do well. So we know that he or she needs X, Y, and Z. And if you're going to take that away, then we're going to see a decline. Now, sometimes there's technical issues having to do with continuing qualification for special education. The educators, the administrators will say, they're doing too well. They're doing too well, and we have to. Well, sometimes the answer is something called a 504 service agreement, which is not special education, but it allows a school to provide supports for the child. So that's one thing that happens. Sometimes we'll say, okay, the student doesn't need certain things that they were getting before, but they absolutely continue to need these things. And so we're going to change his program and say that he will get these accommodations through a 504 service agreement, which is a different way of addressing students' needs. It's based on civil rights legislation that says that you can't discriminate against children based on their disabilities, and you have to level the playing field. So again, it's a federal law, but it's very, very different from special education. But I see it used effectively sometimes when kids don't need certain things, but continue to need other things and don't qualify for special education. That's one way. The other way is, I mean, the whole time that you're engaged with your student and teachers, you have to be focusing on developing relationships with the teachers and the administrators, because you're going to always come to a snag. There's always going to be a snag. And if you have a history of communicating with these folks and a history of being an advocate, then I think it's going to be much better, much easier to deal with these snags when they happen. So let me just say that I should have said that to begin with. But there are times you're going to have to fight. Again, it comes to that point where there are going to be times when you are put in a position where you're going to have to be adversarial with your school about continuing supports, especially if you've been able to demonstrate, or it's been demonstrated by his or her performance, that when you take the support away, that the child doesn't do well. To me, that's data, that's evidence. And nowadays, everything has to be evidence-based. Well, if there's evidence that your student is not doing well when the support goes away, then the school must consider reinstating that support. And sometimes you have to go to due process, sometimes you have to get the advocate. God forbid you get the lawyer involved, but sometimes that's what has to happen.
That is true. Well, thank you so much, Maria. This was so useful information.
Welcome.
I really appreciate that you're helping all the parents out there, including myself.
Oh, no problem. I'm really happy to do it. And I think this is a wonderful thing that you're doing, Cheatham, and good luck, and let me know if there's anything else I can do.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.